In the previous video, I talked about the introduction to transcendental logic, which is the meaty part of the Critique of Pure Reason, one of arguably the hardest parts of the book. So in the previous video, I explained many concepts that you may need to be aware of, such as what is general logic, what is transcendental logic. If you are unsure about the differences of those terms, just go back to the video. I explain it very briefly and give definitions provided by Kant as well. I'm not going to do a video of the whole transcendental logic. It would be 10 hours long. And I don't want to do this for 10 hours in a day. So today we're just going to focus on the metaphysical deduction, which is the first part of the transcendental logic. The metaphysical deduction is the origin of the categories and judgments. How do they originate, and how many types of categories do we have, and how they derive from judgments. So that's the topic of today. Also, I wanted to point out as well that the transcendental logic, apart from being divided into the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction, the transcendental logic is also divided into the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles. So both the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction are part of the analytic of concepts. It's just to keep that in mind as well. But just in case, if you don't want to watch the video because it's still half an hour long, I will just briefly explain what the main concepts are again. So we just passed the transcendental aesthetic, that was about space and time. Now we are in the transcendental logic, which studies, or it is the science of the a priori laws for the cognition of knowledge. So what are the a priori structures that allow us to understand the world? That transcendental logic, which studies the a priori structures, is divided into the transcendental analytic, which is where we are right now. Then the second part is the transcendental dialectic, which explains the main mistakes that we commit when we talk about logic. Sometimes we take pure logic and we think that we can apply that pure logic onto real life, but that's not how it works. So the transcendental dialectic would be defined as bad sense, how we apply things that are not properly applied. Things that are not properly applied because we've used pure logic as a organon and not a canon. Right, so we're in the transcendental analytic. Now, the transcendental analytic, as I said, is divided into the analytic of concepts and the analytic of principles. We are in the analytic of concepts, which is where the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deductions reside. And again, the metaphysical deduction talks about the origin of the categories. Kant provides the definition of the transcendental analytic at B89. He says, transcendental analytic consists in the dissection of all of a priori knowledge into the elements that pure understanding by itself yields. In so doing, the following are the points of chief concern. 1. That the concepts be pure and not empirical. 2. That they belong not to intuition or sensibility, but to thought and understanding. 3. That they be fundamental and be carefully distinguished from those which are derivative or composite. 4. That our table of concepts be complete, covering the whole field of the pure understanding. So basically Kant is explaining that the transcendental analytic talks about what are those a priori structures that we use to understand empirical things, that they are pure. We're not talking about applied concepts, we're just talking about the pure structures. For Kant, pure understanding is completely not empirical and completely separate from all sensibility. In Kant's words, the pure understanding is self-sufficient and self-subsistent. Okay, that's enough about the transcendental analytic. Right, now, as I said, we are in the analytic of concepts, which is the categories and judgments. Kant also provides a definition of the analytic of concepts, and that is at B90. He says, by analytic of concepts, I do not understand their analysis, but the hitherto rarely attempted dissection of the faculty of the understanding itself, the categories and the judgment, to investigate the possibility of concepts a priori by looking for them in the understanding alone. So Kant is going to delve very deeply in how we understand things. And in his opinion, the only way we can understand the way we understand things is with the existence of judgment. And how are we going to meant to do this? At B91, he explains that we shall therefore follow up the pure concepts to the first seeds and dispositions in the human understanding, go to the root. in which they lie prepared till at last, on the occasion of experience, they are developed. So as I said, we're not going to apply anything here. Nothing is going to be applied to how things are empirically. It's just the background knowledge, that a priority of the understanding. For example, in order to make it less obscure, let's take causality. In Kant's method, we should not take causality, or we shouldn't derive causality from just observing events. Otherwise, that would not be a priori, because then we will get the idea of causality from empirical perceptions. And that's not what Kant is saying. We need to look in the understanding first for a conceptual seed or root corresponding to relational judgments, which is the cause and effect. That seed, which is a pure concept of relation, is present. It's already present in the mind. It's always been there. So then when intuition, that comes a posteriori, the things that we see with intuition, the things that we see with sensibility. So when that intuition supplies a temporal sequence, the understanding applies the causality concept to unify that sequence of events that don't have anything in common apart from that contingency. One of them happens after the other. They have no unifying concept apart from the fact that one happens after the other. What we do in our understanding is to take that concept, unify it into a sequence of event-object. Causality is a pure concept already prepared in the understanding and developed when experience furnishes or takes all that manifold that is experience. Just change the angle of the camera because you can only see my head. Right, so the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, why do we need analytic of concepts, and how the hell are we going to get to the seed of the situation? How are we going to get access to the pure concept of the understanding? No one, as far as I'm concerned, had done that before Kant, and Kant acknowledged that, and he knows that it's going to be a very hard journey. But this is precisely why we need the metaphysical deduction in the first place. Some philosophers previously have tried several methods to understand the faculty of the understanding, and like Locke, Hume have taken chunks of empirical knowledge and organized it into groups that seem similar enough. But empirical gathering of concepts is never guaranteed to be complete. I may gather as many concepts and as many similarities in the empirical world. I could be 99.999% that I've got everything. I've got all the concepts that I can derive from the empirical world, but I would never be able to know that I am finished, because I do not have a method to know what is the possibility, how many of them there could be in total. So I would be a little bit in darkness. That's why we need a method that, instead of turning to the empirical world to see how many categories, concepts, organizers of knowledge we have, we may need to look at it from a priori, with an a priori method. And again, Kant thinks that that method that Locke or the empiricists have used is not systematic enough. And he says, well, the good thing about my transcendental philosophy is that it just follows one principle, and that is that concepts come from the understanding as an absolute unit, as we will see. The pure concepts are internal to the understanding. They are already there, and they must be ordered by the understanding's unity. So Kant's principle is, don't collect anything empirically. Instead, start from the unity of the understanding and its forms of judgment. Those logical functions are the a priori structural operations of the mind, and each such logical form has a corresponding pure concept, which is a category. Alright then, Kant, so we can't use empirical objects in order for us to organize our understanding. Okay, we get it. However, how are we going to do this then? How are we going to organize structures of knowledge? And this is one of the biggest problems that Kant had to face. He asked himself this question. We've got the faculties of sensibility, which is us receiving things, right? It's the faculty of intuition. We get empirical intuitions all the time. And then on the other hand, we've got the understanding, which is the world of concepts, how we create judgments out of the things that we see. For example, I could see a book in front of me, and I see its shape, I see the space it occupies. But then my understanding could take the judgment that that is a novel, or that is a philosophical book, and it's got 500 pages. That doesn't depend on my faculty of sensibility. So the problem for Kant was, we're always relying upon the fact that these two faculties work together perfectly. You see things using sensibility, you get a concept, you make a concept out of it. You're mixing sensibility and understanding together. You're putting a bridge that links both together. But what is the justification about this bridge? Why should we create a link between the sensibility and the understanding? That was Kant's bigger question, one of the biggest questions. So I want you to keep that in mind. That question is one of the questions that Kant wants to answer. The understanding cannot be a faculty of intuition, that's the sensibility. So if understanding does not take care of intuitions, it must then take care of concepts. And knowledge, and this is the assumption that Kant makes, is the addition of sensibility plus understanding, of intuition plus concepts. There's a very important quote that I did not understand at the beginning, and I went a little bit crazy about it. But I think I do have an understanding of it now, so let's have a look at it. That is B93. Kant says, whereas all intuitions are sensible rest on affections, concepts rest on functions. By function, I mean the unity of the act of bringing various representations under one common representation. And this is the first time Kant talks about function. So for Kant, a function is something that performs a task, something that performs a certain task. What is the function of the ladder? Going up and down. What is the function of the understanding? Judge concepts. So Kant acknowledges that a concept is not immediately related to an object. What is immediately attached to an object is a sensible intuition, because we already have space and time ingrained in our brains. Therefore, as Kant says, no concept is ever related to an object immediately, but to some other representation of it, be that other representation an intuition or itself a concept. So judgments, as they deal with concepts, cannot be made immediately like intuition. Judgment is therefore the immediate knowledge of an object, that is, the representation of it. In every judgment there is a concept which holds of many representations, and among them of a given representation that is immediately related to an object. So concepts, unlike intuitions, are general. Many things can fall into a concept. Many intuitions can fall into a concept. Also, he says, judgment is therefore the immediate knowledge. By immediate, I think Kant means that you can create many concepts with no content until you give it an intuition to refer to. If you don't give it an intuition to refer to, it's just going to be an abstract concept that does not really refer to anything. So you would just be talking about ideas that have really no meaning. So now Kant is going to establish a hierarchy where concepts refer to an object or multiple objects. Concepts make judgments, and those judgments make arguments. That is how we work. That is how we make arguments. We start with concepts, then with judgments, and then with arguments. So a concept could be a body. Okay, so a body, that's a concept. There's multiple things that can fall under the concept of bodies. My body, your body, a dog's body. Then we can make a judgment out of that concept, which could be all bodies are divisible. That would be a judgment. And why is this a judgment? Because we've got two concepts, right? We've got the concept of body, and we also have the concept of divisible. So that judgment has made possible the collection of certain concepts and resulted in a higher representation in that hierarchy that gives us more knowledge. And then you could go even higher and make an argument about it, a logical argument, for example, where you add different judgments and put them together. So the understanding is constantly making this sort of judgments by collecting different concepts there and there. So we can say that the understanding is a faculty of judgment. And judgments are essentially to say that one thing falls under something else. In the previous example, a body falls in the concept of divisible, or this table, or the table falls under the concept of rectangle. But there's many ways we could join judgments, right? I could say all bodies are divisible, or the table is rectangular, but I could also say all trees are plants, or some humans are female. There are different ways of bringing concepts together. I could also say contradictory things. I could say dogs are mammals and dogs are not mammals. So the metaphysical deduction ranges between paragraph 9 and 12, depending on the edition you have, but it's 9 to 12, that's the whole metaphysical deduction. The aim of the metaphysical deduction is to reveal the categories in the pure understanding, why they are a priori, and how we derive them from judgments. And this is important to mention. The metaphysical deduction is not going to attempt to justify or to talk about the legitimacy of the categories. So, for example, the metaphysical deduction is not going to deal with the fact that causality is applied legitimately to empirical objects. It just shows that we possess some a priori concepts that are a priori and have its source in the pure understanding. Right, okay, so here we have the table of judgments. Again, these are derived from the faculty of the understanding that deals with the judgments, and these are the ways in which judgments can be brought together. There are 4 different forms of judgment. We have quantity, relation, modality, and quality. I didn't say it in order. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So let's start with quantity. Those can be universal, particular, or singular. And what does this mean? So these are the judgments that tells you or tells us about how much extension the judgment claims. For example, I could say all dogs are mammals. That would be universal because all the dogs are mammals. But then I could say some dogs are brown. That would be particular because I'm talking about a particular type of dog maybe, or some dogs that are brown, but there could be other colors. And of singularity, of singular would be this dog that I've got in front of me, which is called Rex, is a mammal. So universal is all, particular is some, and singular is this. Right, then we have quality. Quality is affirmative, negative, or infinite. Okay, the infinite one is a weird one, but let's just go to the easy one. So affirmative is just affirming something. So I could say, for example, the glass is full. That's an affirmation, isn't it? I could also have a negation, which is the glass is not full. Easy. The infinite judgments are supposed to express a limitation by denying a determination. So just to give you an example, I could say the soul is non-mortal. So I'm making an affirmation, but the affirmation also implies a negation of something else. So it is not a positive determination, but a negation that leaves another determination open. It is technically really an affirmation. I'm not going to extend myself in the infinite judgments. They're a bit weird. It's long story short, it's just when you affirm, but at the same time you're negating because you're using an adjective that implies a negation. All right, in relation we have categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. Categorical is when we make a statement in the sense of S is P. So we make a logical connection between the subject and the predicate. So I could say Joanna is a human, but then I could make a hypothetical judgment, which would be if it rains, I will get wet. And then you have the disjunctive, which is one thing or the other. Either I go to the park or I stay at home and read Kant. Pretty straightforward. Right, modality. And the names here, again, are a little bit weird. So we've got problematic, assertoric, and apodictic. The mode of the judgment concerns the possibility, the actuality, the necessity, or the attitude towards a judgment. When you say that a judgment is problematic, it means that it is possible, but it may not. So for example, if I say it may be raining or it may be snowing, that is problematic because it's not certain, it's just possible. Then if I say that a judgment is assertoric, that's when I make an actual statement. It is raining. So problematic is it might, assertoric is it is actually. And now you have apodictic, which is it should be raining, it should be snowing. Not only is happening, but it is also necessary. So note how this is the basic of everything. All of this table of judgment is the basis of everything that Kant will derive to make possible the categories. And this is also the basis of our understanding. Without these judgments, you would not be able to think anything. You would not be able to think about anything without these judgments. Think about it. Can you think of any statement that you can make, any judgment that you can make without these judgments? You're always affirming something or negating something or making a hypothetical judgment. You're always using a combination of this in order to create any kind of thought. So that was paragraph 9, table of judgment. We move on to paragraph 10 of the metaphysical deduction. So in this paragraph, Kant goes from the table of judgments to objects. How do we apply this judgment into objects? Because again, there's a problem of a link here. So we've got judgments, yeah, okay, I know what judgments are now. That's how I work in order to make any kind of sense of what I see. But how do we apply those judgments onto objects? Judgments are forms of thought, they're concepts, so they abstract from all kind of content. And the categories are meant to be the condition for thinking objects. That is precisely the study of how thoughts relate a priori to objects. And the categories uses the material provided by sensibility, which is space and time, that we saw from the transcendental aesthetic. So the link between this table of judgments and objects is made by something that Kant calls synthesis. And again, this is the first time that appears in the Critique of Pure Reason. Very important concept, so we're going to dwell on it a little bit. So, thank God, Kant gives a definition of synthesis. By synthesis, in its most general sense, this is B103, I understand the act of putting different representations together and of grasping what is manifold in one act of knowledge. Such a synthesis is pure if the manifold is not empirical but is given a priori, and is the manifold in space and time, before we can first arise by way of analysis. Synthesis of manifold, be it given empirically or a priori, is what first gives rise to knowledge. This knowledge may indeed at first be crude and confused, and therefore in need of analysis. Still, the synthesis is that which gathered the elements of knowledge and unites them to form a certain content. What does this mean? Because this may sound a little bit of gibberish because we haven't seen that before. So we go back to the transcendental aesthetic. We learned that space and time are pure intuitions, and they give us a manifold. The manifold being structured but undigested multiplicity of impressions. That is the manifold. So everything that you see is undigested. It's kind of structured because it's already filtered through space and time. But you're still many multiplicities of manifolds. So that manifold in itself is raw data. It doesn't give you any knowledge yet. And now is the role of the understanding that comes in handy, because for the manifold to become knowledge, the understanding must actively connect it. Somehow they've got to be put together, so then the impression finds the understanding and then we get knowledge. For Kant, this happens thanks to the synthesis, which is the act of connecting impression and understanding. Without synthesis, intuitions would stay as a chaotic flow of impressions, pure, raw data, but nothing else. So sensibility gives us raw data, space and time, through space and time. Then the understanding thinks that data through synthesis. And then the categories are the pure rules of synthesis, the necessary ways of understanding and what organizes data into objects of experience. Synthesis in general, as we shall hereafter see, is a mere result of the power of imagination, blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we should have no knowledge whatsoever, but of which we are scarcely ever conscious. We do not acknowledge this act of synthesis, but it's still there. To bring this synthesis to concepts is a function which belongs to the understanding, and it is through this function of the understanding that we first obtain knowledge properly so called. So this pure synthesis leads to the pure concepts of the understanding. So if that is synthesis, according to Kant, there's also a pure synthesis that instead of giving you some kind of knowledge that is a posteriori, that pure synthesis gets you pure concepts of the understanding, which is the categories. At B104, he says, pure synthesis, different from synthesis, remember, pure synthesis represented in its most general aspect gives us the pure concept of the understanding. The concepts which give unity to this pure synthesis rest on the understanding. So if the synthesis is empirical, based on experience, you get ordinary empirical concepts. And if the synthesis is pure a priori, you get the categories. And also now getting into the process on how we cognize an object. In the previous quote, Kant mentioned the imagination, which is something that he's introduced now, but he hasn't properly defined it yet. So we're just gonna play with the concept of imagination without having a definition just yet, but we can intuit what imagination could be for Kant. So right, how we cognize an object. We get the manifold of space and time. We add synthesis, and apparently synthesis runs through the imagination. Then that is brought to concepts by the understanding, the ability to judge, and that is equal to cognition. The synthesis all unifies manifold into representations of one particular representation, and without it we will have no knowledge. Then the imagination performs this synthesis blindly. It is pre-conscious, but it is necessary. Then the understanding applies concepts to synthesis, and that's how we get proper knowledge. And finally, the pure synthesis leads the categories. All those categories structure all possible experience. That's why there are a priori structures of the understanding. Right, okay, so this is very abstract. Let's just take an example. I'm just going to take the example of the tree, which everyone uses. So sensibility would give you patches of green, rough texture, a tall shape. All of that you get through intuition when you see a tree, right? Then your imagination synthesizes it into one thing, one unity, and then you get a unified manifold, all these intuitions in one. That's the tree. And then the understanding applies the category of substance, which is the unified manifold, and then you recognize that is, or you cognize that is a tree. So again, this final use of the categories, this final function of the categories is that it allows us to take the concepts that we get when we take judgments and apply them to objects. So that is in brief how Kant thinks that we cognize objects. Right, also after explaining how we cognize objects, Kant just kind of separates or goes off on a different thing, starts talking about different things, and he makes a very interesting parallel that I wanted to mention. This is at B105. The same function which gives unity to the various representation in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition, and this unity, in its most general expression, we entitle the pure concept of the understanding. So here, the very same mental function that unifies representations in a judgment, the analytic unity, is the function that unifies the manifold of intuition, the synthetic unity. The formal functions of judgment give the clue to the corresponding pure concepts, which are the categories that the understanding brings a priori to experience. Can't move here is this mental operation is the same in both cases, unifying multiplicity into one. Thus, each logical function of judgment in that table that we've seen has a transcendental parallel or a transcendental counterpart, a pure concept of the understanding that makes that synthesis possible for objects. And what is the result? The 12 categories of the understanding: quantity, quality, relation, modality, i.e. the metaphysical deductions table. However, before we get into the table of categories, which surprisingly looks very similar to the judgments, okay, because it's supposed to be a parallel counterpart. One of them is not transcendental, the other one is transcendental. I want to make an important remark, and I cannot emphasize that enough. Kant's metaphysical deduction is not trying to prove that the categories really do apply to objects of experience, not trying to justify it yet. That would be the transcendental deductions work. What we're trying to do now is a method of discovery of those categories. Kant is giving those candidates of pure concepts that could be derived from the logical forms of the judgment. The move from this table to this table, and why should we move from those two tables, one to the other, that is reserved for the transcendental deduction. Okay, that justification to go from one to the other is not justified yet. So, very quickly then, what is the difference between the judgments and the categories? So the judgments are the logical functions of the understanding. It is a mental act. If we were to give a formal definition, would be something like the formal operations of the understanding whereby representations are combined under a common relation. Universal versus particular, affirmative versus negatives, hypothetical versus categorical. And they are purely logical in the sense of pure logic. They describe how the mind combines concepts in thought without regard to the concept or the content of experience. So when I say all bodies are divisible, this shows the logical form of a categorical, because I'm saying S is P, universal because all bodies are divisible, and it's also affirmative, so it could be multiple judgments, multiple type of judgments at the same time. And then on the other hand, categories, as I said multiple times, they are a priori concepts of the understanding. They are what make judgments about objects possible, and the conceptual rule and the judgments are a priori. If I were to give a definition, it would be something like the categories are the fundamental a priori concepts that underlie the possibility of objective experience by relating the manifold of intuition in space and time to the unity of our perception. So it is the unity of, is that complete synthesis that we get through the imagination. And the categories are transcendental. They're not merely logical, they're transcendental. For example, let's take the category of causality. Causality states that every event must stand under a rule connecting it to a cause. This is not just a logical function, that would be the judgment, but conditioned for something to be experienced as an event at all. So as rational beings, we come upon different judgments. We can't help it. It's already in how our mind works. It is as if we come equipped with certain logical forms, which are those judgments. And that is the source of the categories. Because the understanding is the faculty of judgment, the understanding is thus the source of the categories. And what is the argument that Kant makes? The details of the arguments, to go from one thing to the other, is in the transcendental deduction. And I'm going to give you a spoiler, it's rather obscure. So basically, Kant concludes that the categories are the forms of judgment applied to objects, and that they are the concepts of an object in general, by means of which its intuition is regarded as determined with regard to one of the logical functions for judgments. But again, I'm not going to get into that yet. I will suffer, and I will give myself that type of suffering in the next video. Right, so again, we've got this table of categories, and you will see that it's quite similar to the table of judgments. So I'm going to put both here on the screen, and we're going to compare them. Okay, but let's first delve into the table of categories. Let's see what we've got here. So we have unity, quantity. We have 4 different sections, which is again what Kant did with the judgments. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality, same thing. Right, there is 3 in each section. Why 3? I don't know. Kant says that it had to be 3 and is very symmetrical, that the fact that there are 3. Then we have plurality. There are several horses, for example, and then totality, the herd as a whole. Then we'll move on to quality. So in quality we have reality, negation, and limitation. In reality, we could have something like, it's a positive determination, so we could have something like, there is hit. A negation would be, there is no hit, just the negation, the denial. And limitation is limiting our determination. So you could say, not infinite hit. Okay, it's like bounded. it's got some boundaries. Then we move on to relation. So we have substance, which is what endures, the substratum. That would be, for example, the tree is the bearer of certain properties. Okay, any substance is the bearer of certain properties. A dog is a bearer of certain properties. A human is the bearer of certain properties. That is substance. Then we have causality, cause and effect. For example, ball A caused the movement of ball B. And then community, which is a very strange one. And we will get to that in a moment. How did Kant come up with this? But community is basically a reciprocity between the agent and the patient. So it's an interaction, a reciprocal influence. For example, two bodies mutually compress. That would be of community. So it's some kind of like reciprocity between two bodies or two objects. And then finally we have modality. So that would be possibility or impossibility. This could happen, this could not happen. Existence or not existence. This does exist, this does not exist. And necessity or contingency. This must be so, or this may be otherwise. Also, just as a remark as well, the categories can be divided into two groups, the mathematical and the dynamical, and the distinction have grounds in the nature of the understanding. I'm not going to get very deep into this, but the mathematical would be those are concerned with objects of intuition, pure as well as empirical, and the dynamical would be concerned with the existence of these objects in their relation to each or to the understanding. Right, we're going to move on to paragraph 11, which is various remarks that Kant makes just to make sure that we've got the point. And he draws several conclusions from the table of categories. The first one is that the 12 split naturally into two functional groups, which is the mathematical, about the form of objects, and the dynamical, which is about the existence and relations. The second conclusion is that every class is triadic. There's three moments, there's three different things in each section. And the third moment is not merely derivative, but requires a distinct act of the understanding, and it is derived from the first two. For example, in unity and plurality, there are independent categories, but totality, which is the third one, would be derived from the fusion of unity and plurality. And we have the same of quality, so reality and negation would give rise to limitation, and so on and so forth. That is what Kant says. And then he also says that the category of community, especially needs explanation, because it seems that it was derived from judgment disjunctive, and we can't clearly see the relation there, so he's going to try and explain it. So for Kant, the mathematical categories are the first two, so quantity and quality, and they concern how an object is given in intuition, measures, number, determination of what the object is, so that's the unity, plurality, totality, is related to mathematics, right? One thing, two things, three things, plurality, unity, okay, the unity is only one, and then reality, negation, limitation is very related to mathematics in a way. And then the dynamical are the categories or the two sections of relation and modality, and that concerns how objects exist and interact. And here we have substance, we have causality, reciprocal interaction, modal status, the possibility, existence, and necessity. And he explains that counting things uses mathematical categories, as I said, related to the unity, the plurality, the totality. But explaining motion, for example, uses dynamical categories because it's the cause and effect. You don't really use any mathematical notion to explain that. You use the forces, necessity, hypothetical laws maybe. So for unity, you could say this one apple. For plurality, 3 apples. For totality, the basket, totality of apples. And then for dynamical, you could say of substance, the apple persists through changes as a substance, right? Then you could have causality. The fall was caused by the wind. The apple fell caused by gravity. And then the community would be something like apples on the tree interact. They share nutrients. They influence each other in some kind of way. I'm not a biologist. I don't know exactly how, but they will kind of influence between each other, give nutrients through the tree. And the modality would be something like those apples must ripen in summer. It will be a necessity. Again, these are just examples, okay? Don't take them really seriously. It's just for you to understand and for me to understand what Kant is meaning here. Right, also, the second conclusion, why are they divided into 3? Why 3? So each class has 3 moments, and the third is formed by a combination of the first 2. And as I said, totality is plurality considered as unity, according to Kant. The crucial part here is that Kant insists that the third moment of every section is a primary category too, and he does not really say anything else about that, so that's what he says. And then a third conclusion, the tackling of how we go from the disjunctive judgment to the community category, because there's not an immediate connection there. So at first glance, the disjunctive judgment, either or, doesn't look like reciprocity. That is true. Kant argues that they do, however. At division, the parts, so when you divide something, when you make a disjunctive judgment, the parts are coordinate and mutually determining. So if one part is posited, the others are excluded, vice versa. And as an analogy, you could say that the parts of a physical whole, so the bodies in a system, are independent substances, yet reciprocally determine each other. Mutual attraction or repulsion. This reciprocity is the category of community, according to Kant. So I think the relation that Kant's trying to make here is that the interaction of objects creates some sort of community. It's not one thing, it is the other, but that gives a sense of everything has aim, everything has a function. So if it's not one thing, it's going to be the other. So that gives a sense of community. We belong to the same world, and the fact that we can cut it up into a disjunction, they may have a complemental relation somehow. And finally, section 12, the last section of the metaphysical deduction. We're almost there. So section 12 is not as important as the other parts of the metaphysical deduction, but there's still some things that we could have a look at. Here's something quite interesting, actually. He says that the transcendentalists, that the medieval transcendentals, the ones about the one, truth, good, which were talked by many medieval thinkers, are actually not that far from the truth. They're not extra mysterious properties of things in themselves. Actually, those are logical criteria that reside in the mind: the unity, the truth, and the completeness of something. And these criteria that were talked about by many medieval thinkers, religious people, theologists, simply reflect in a very formal way the already established categories of quantity, unity, plurality, and totality. No new categories are added to that triad of one, true, and good. I thought that was very interesting that Kant compared those three almost like mystical qualities to the categories. Again, I just thought, no further comment here, I just thought that was very interesting. Well, I guess I'll make a comment. So, medieval thinkers claimed those universal predicates. I had to look that up, that those are unum, verum, bonum, so one, true, good, and that applies to every being. So Kant asked whether these are additional a priori predicates, new categories, or if that was already inside the table of categories. Kant's diagnosis is like, well, no, that actually is part of the categories, they just didn't realize it. So those three terms, as traditionally used, are not metaphysical things of properties in themselves. That is a mistake that the medieval thinkers had, but they are actually logical requirements for us to process, understand anything. The one is the unity, because it's a single thing or the unifying notion of something. So that checks out. Then the truth would be the qualitative plurality of some kind of characteristic, because the concept yields many true consequences. So that tree is a plant, that tree is a plant, that tree is a plant. You create a plurality. Those more consequences of all those trees being plants, that's a confirmation for an objective reality. So that's related to truth in some way. And then we have the perfection, which is goodness. That is the qualitative completeness or the totality. So the plurality of consequences coheres back into and is fully accounted for by the unity of concept. And again, I just thought that was very interesting. If someone knows more about this, can they leave it in the comments? Because I think I do understand what Kant meant, but still quite obscure in the way he wrote it. So if you know more, please let me know. Right, okay, so that's all the sections of the metaphysical deduction. Now, I want to do a little bit of a transition to the transcendental deduction, which is whether the categories are legitimately applied to objects, the justification. How do we go from categories to objects? How is that legitimate? How is that justified? So having established that the categories are rooted a priori in basic logical forms of judgments, Kant will, in the transcendental deduction, try to establish their legitimacy for objects of experience. This will require showing that experience has to be structured in a way that it answers to those forms of logical judgments and thus to the pure concept of understanding. And unfortunately, Kant thus not, as we may have hoped, give arguments illustrating the application of each category to experience and explaining how each of these categories contribute to making experience possible. He does not do that because you will be relying then on empirical terms, then you will not be 100% sure that you've got all of them right. So he's not going to do that. He's going to do it from a priority, never relying on the content, always just relying on their pure understanding. So the way he's going to do it is he's going to explain how, or he's going to establish at a very aggressively abstract level, the conformity of experience to the categories as such. And this is going to be the next video. Transcendental deduction. Right, okay. Thank you so much for staying up until here. You are brave. We are brave. We know that we can do it. And now to just digest everything that we have done so far, I would like to do a little bit of an assessment. Questions that I asked myself, I created some answers. If they are wrong, please let me know. Let's just assess ourselves, shall we? Question 1. What is the goal of the transcendental logic in Kant's system? To investigate the rules of thought concerning objects given in intuition. Question number 2. How does the transcendental analytic differ from the transcendental aesthetic? So the analytic, the transcendental analytic, treats the understanding and its concepts, whereas the aesthetic treats sensibility and its forms, forms of pure intuition such as space and time. Question number 3. What does Kant seek to derive in the metaphysical deduction? The derivation of the categories from the logical forms of judgment, those two tables. Question number 4. How are the categories related to the logical forms of judgment? Because the categories correspond to and are derived from the table of judgments. Question number 5. Why does Kant call his deduction metaphysical? Why the word metaphysical? Because it investigates the pure a priori origin of concepts, nothing empirical. Cool, well, that will be it. I will see you in the next video and we will talk about the first part of the transcendental deduction. I think I'm going to split the transcendental deduction into 2 different parts because it's quite long. So I will deal with the first version first and then the second version. I will see how I do it, but there will be 2 videos about it. Bye!